Over the years, Dungeons & Dragons has been the subject of a few different controversies regarding representation of people or cultures. Today I'm going to be talking specifically about the Vistani in the campaign Curse of Strahd, which are essentially a one-to-one representation of the Romani people inside Dungeons & Dragons. Before that, though, I think it would be best if I give you some more context the entire fantasy genre has had over the years with regards to things like racism. So, with that in mind, let's get right into it, as I tell you a little bit more about what we mean exactly when we talk about fantastical racism. So what exactly is fantastic racism, then? Well, to put it in as simple of terms as possible, it's like replacing a group of people with something that isn't actually in reality. For example, if white and black people lived in perfect harmony, but because there was orcs, then now those people are against the orcs. This gets even touchier when sometimes you'll have those new creatures like orcs take on exaggerated features of cultures or people that exist in the real world. An easy target to look at this is always elves in media. They're pretty much universally displayed as these superior groups of people that are usually all very pale, but they have advanced science or magic or history, they're longer lived, and generally look down on everybody else. I think you can see where I'm going with this. So I'm going to move on to a negative topic instead, talking about the trolls from World of Warcraft. You won't find these guys starting drama on Twitter. Instead, they're more than likely practicing voodoo rituals or insinuating that they're trying to sell you drugs.
What you looking for? Me got the good stuff, man.
One of the big problems, especially regarding trolls in World of Warcraft, is that even amongst the Horde, which is their own faction, they're considered an exception to the rest of their race. The player characters are from a group of trolls that have broken away from most of the trolls on the continent and have instead decided to join the Horde, whereas all of the ones outside are primitive, tribal, and attack you on sight. They're wholly evil and regarded as monsters, essentially. And this is something that has plagued the fantasy genre for a very long time. Even Dungeons & Dragons has something similar, with R.A. Salvatore's books focusing around the protagonist Driz Do'Urden. He's a drow that's broken away from his own people that live underground and are a completely evil and opposite society to the above-ground elves. And of course, as a result of that, he faces a lot of outward prejudice from other characters in the books, some of them even outright insulting him or refusing to work with him based purely on the color of his skin. And of course, in spite of that, Driz Do'Urden is a very noble, heroic, and good adventurer. He embodies the opposite of everything that his people in the story embody, and even throughout D&D still embody. As of now, R.A. Salvatore has done a great job of recognizing these issues in the fantasy genre and even in his own work. And in an interview with the Public Medievalist, he had this quote to say that I really like. He says, "In fantasy, you embody evil in a race, and then you disembody it with your sword. And that's also what mankind has done through the centuries, right? By dehumanizing the enemy so you don't feel bad about killing them. But that's just blatantly immoral when you get right down to it. And yet, I love fantasy. So that's the paradox I've had to deal with." So what does any of this have to do with Curse of Strahd? Well, between the Vistani and the Romani, the line is a lot less clear than something like the orcs from Lord of the Rings or the trolls from World of Warcraft. And fans of Dungeons & Dragons have pretty much been arguing over the Vistani since they were created, all the way back in the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. That's not to say it's all bad. Wizards of the Coast has certainly done a good job of removing a lot of the unnecessarily harmful stereotypes and language used to depict the Vistani, especially in the recent edition of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. And that includes getting rid of some of the more distasteful art, like this splash screen here, and replacing it with some of the newer pieces from the re-release of Curse of Strahd in the collector's set. But aside from just physical appearance, what are some of the actual problems with the Vistani in Curse of Strahd? As an American, I don't really have any first-hand experience with Romani people, so I had to do a little research. I did end up finding this great article from Vaclav Volok titled "Envy, Corruption, and Hard Racism, Studying Anti-Gypsyism as an Ideological Fantasy." It does a really good job of breaking down the pretty much exact tenets of this movement called anti-Gypsyism that persists in Eastern Europe even today. It talks about a lot of the stereotypes and stigma that faced by the Roma people. Reading through it, you can see a lot of parallels directly to the way Vistani are portrayed inside of Curse of Strahd. When the Vistani were first created in Curse of Strahd, they were depicted as a very brutish, wandering band of charlatans and minstrels that resorted to thievery, were constantly drunk, and if anyone got on their wrong side, they would curse them with this evil eye. All nearly one-to-one stereotypes people try to levy against Romani people, even today, and in media over the past few hundred years in Europe. Wizards of the Coast has since corrected this, but some of the damage done by this initial impression has already taken roots. According to Alok, one of the core principles of modern anti-gypsyism, as he describes it, is envy. Romani people are designated as a protected class and are granted special privileges from the state, such as universal income or food and welfare. And to the common man, this appears like the Romani is cheating them. They're directly stealing from what they work to obtain. And in Curse of Strahd, this same core principle exists almost in perfect parallel. The Vistani are granted special rights by the ruler, Count Strahd, and are the ones that hold the exclusive ability to move in and out of Barovia as they wish. This, of course, generates a lot of jealousy and anger and a lot of distrust from the other residents of Barovia towards them. And because of this special relationship the Vistani have with Count Strahd, most of them work directly under him. All of them, aside from a select few that you may encounter, are almost exclusively designated as evil. And to make matters worse, the campaign does nothing to attempt to offer the DM ways to correct this, or to even try to throw players off the trail of offering them a red herring or two. There's a disclaimer near the beginning of the campaign that lets the DM know about some of the sweeping changes that they've made, some of the things they've removed to try and make it much more friendly towards everyone inside the book, but other than that, doesn't really change anything. So unless your DM does the extra work of writing out a bunch of new encounters and role-playing scenarios involving the Vistani to your players, they'll have no reason to believe they're anything other than a bunch of minions. Which is really a shame when you have the opportunity to tell this interpersonal story between the different members of Vistani tribes and camps versus the fears and worries of all of the villagers across Barovia, and it just gets left entirely up to whatever the DM figures is best. Especially when you consider the fact that Curse of Strahd as a campaign works best when it plays on the player's own conceptions of the current state of the world, and having the opportunity to use the Vistani as a healthy vessel to place mistrust in the players and make them doubt what they've heard from other sources, and you lose that great source of mystery. And that, I think, too, is one of the biggest problems in the way that Wizards of the Coast has carried out a lot of their modern source books. I mean, if you look at Strixhaven, A Curriculum of Chaos, a lot of people were expecting this grand, sweeping introduction to this, frankly, huge world that's in Magic the Gathering already, that already has tons and tons of lore that you can pull from. And then in the D&D supplement, instead, we got a short snippet of lore about each of the colleges and a small, half-baked adventure with one or two clues for each step. I think author Michael Underwood said it best when he said, "Gaming is used to communicate and perform cultural capital and identity through fictional narratives." Meaning, at its core, D&D is a great way for us to work together and collaborate to create shared experiences. And this is something that Wizards of the Coast over the past few years seems to have just forgotten. They expect the individual DM to do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to rationaling or explaining what's actually happening inside of a campaign, instead of having these diverse source books that actually explain their entire breadth of content. A great example of this is The Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, written by Matthew Mercer, a DM from outside of Wizards of the Coast. He has this encyclopedic volume of everything relating to his content that then allows DMs to craft their own stories within the baseline of what he explains as the reality. And having a well thought out source book like this really allows us to take advantage of that community building function of Dungeons & Dragons. That way when we tell people that, oh, we went to the city of Bazzoxan and fought off this demon invasion, they're going to have a similar experience if they've ever been in that area of the content. Now, this is not to say that you've been playing D&D the wrong way. In my opinion, the only way to play D&D incorrectly is to not enjoy it. This is merely meant as a way for you to take a deeper look at some of the things in your campaign and start to think about ways that you can challenge them or take things in a new direction. And I'm by no means an expert. I'm just a DM that's run into these problems before, and I've spent a bit of time thinking about how to get around them for my games. And I'm curious to hear what you think. If you've got an idea or questions, then feel free to let me know. Let's talk about it. Thanks for watching, and I hope I've made your Halloween season campaign a little bit more interesting.